The morning of September 25th, 1995, a fax arrived at the New York offices of Daiwa Bank. It was 11 pages long. It had been written by hand, and it began with 4 words that would end a century-old institution. I have committed fraud. The man who wrote it was Toshihide Iguchi, a senior bond trader, a trusted vice president, a man who had worked for Daiwa for 24 years without a single disciplinary mark on his record. And in that letter, he confessed to hiding $1.10 billion in trading losses over 11 years, across more than 30,000 unauthorized trades, all while his superiors shook his hand and called him one of their best. The losses had been building since 1984. Nobody had noticed, or at least, nobody had wanted to. This is the story of the man who broke Japan's oldest bank and the country that looked away long enough to let him do it. Daiwa Bank was not a flashy institution. That was the point. Founded in Osaka in 1918, it had survived 2 world wars, the atomic age, and the volcanic rise and collapse of Japan's economic miracle. It was the kind of bank that Japanese families trusted with generational wealth, steady, conservative, honorable. By the 1980s, Daiwa had planted its flag in New York. Its office on Liberty Street handled U.S. Treasury bond trading, one of the most liquid, supposedly low-risk markets in the world. Toshihide Iguchi had arrived in New York in 1976. He was 26 years old. He had studied psychology at Southwest Missouri State University, an unusual background for a bond trader. But Daiwa liked him. He was calm. He was precise. He worked long hours without complaint. By 1979, he was running the back office. By the mid-1980s, he was managing the bond trading desk itself. He was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man you wanted handling your money. But there was something Toshihide Iguchi understood about bond trading that his superiors did not. When you control both the trading desk and the back office, the buying and the record-keeping, you control the story. You decide what the numbers say. And in 1984, when Iguchi made a small trading error that cost Daiwa roughly $200,000, he did not report it. He did not absorb the loss cleanly. He did something that would consume the next 11 years of his life.
He covered it up. The mechanics were not complicated. That is what makes them so chilling. Iguchi would take bonds from Daiwa's customer accounts, bonds held in custody for clients who trusted the bank to protect them, and sell them without authorization. He used the proceeds to cover his trading losses. Then he falsified the records to make the bonds appear as if they were still there. The first time it worked, so he did it again and again. Between 1984 and 1995, Iguchi executed approximately 30,000 unauthorized trades. Not all of them were losses. Some made money, but the cumulative damage grew regardless, compounding in the shadows like rot behind a wall. By 1987, he had hidden $100 million in losses. By 1990, $400 million. By 1995, the number had passed $1.10 billion. The bonds missing from client accounts were real bonds, bonds belonging to real pension funds, real institutional investors, real people who believed their assets were sitting safely in a New York vault. They were not. Daiwa's management in Osaka had, over the years, received subtle signals that something was wrong in the New York office. Compliance questions, reconciliation gaps, small anomalies that any competent auditor might have pulled on like a thread. They did not pull. Japanese corporate culture in this era operated on a principle that had no direct English translation but might be rendered as, "Do not ask what you do not want to know." The New York office was profitable on paper. Iguchi was well-liked. The accounts, as presented, reconciled. And so nobody asked. By 1993, Iguchi himself had begun to crack. He had spent nearly a decade living inside a lie that had grown larger than his entire career. He was not living lavishly. He had not stolen the money for himself. He had simply been trying desperately, repetitively, with increasing desperation, to climb back to zero. He never got there. In July of 1995, Toshihide Iguchi sat down and wrote the 11-page letter to Daiwa's president, Akira Fujita. He confessed everything, every loss, every falsified record, every stolen bond. And here is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about the institution that read that letter and chose silence. Daiwa's management received Iguchi's confession in late July 1995.
They did not call the FBI. They did not notify the Federal Reserve. They did not tell the U.S. Treasury or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the American regulators who had direct oversight of Daiwa's U.S. operations. Instead, they flew Iguchi to Osaka. They sat him in a conference room, and they told him to write a more detailed account of what he had done, so that Daiwa's senior leadership could fully understand the damage before deciding what to do next. What they did next is extraordinary. For 2 months, Daiwa's senior executives, including individuals who would later be named in criminal proceedings, actively concealed the confession from American regulators. They transferred assets. They restructured internal accounts. They attempted to quietly absorb the $1.1 billion loss without triggering disclosure requirements. On September 18, 1995, nearly 8 weeks after receiving Iguchi's letter, Daiwa finally reported the loss to Japan's Ministry of Finance. They still had not told American authorities. It was not until September 25th that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was notified. The U.S. government was furious, not just at the fraud, at the cover-up. In the world of American financial regulation, the 2-month gap was not an oversight. It was a violation of federal law. American banks are legally required to report known criminal activity to regulators within a specific window. Daiwa had known. Daiwa had waited. Daiwa had calculated. The Federal Reserve immediately began proceedings to expel Daiwa from the United States banking system. On November 2, 1995, the Federal Reserve ordered Daiwa Bank to close all of its U.S. operations within 90 days. It was the first time in American history that federal regulators had expelled a foreign bank entirely. Not fined, not suspended, expelled. Daiwa's American chapter, 19 years of operations across 16 offices, was over, finished, in 90 days. The criminal proceedings moved quickly by the standards of white-collar crime. Toshihide Iguchi was arrested in October 1995. He cooperated fully with prosecutors. He had, after all, already written the confession himself. He provided testimony against Daiwa's corporate leadership, detailing the cover-up with the same meticulous calm he had once applied to hiding $1.1 billion. In 1996, Iguchi pleaded guilty to charges including fraud and misapplication of bank funds. On December 16, 1996, he was sentenced in a Manhattan federal courtroom. He wore a gray suit. He bowed slightly before the bench. Judge Sharon Grubin sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay a $2.6 million fine. For a man who had hidden $1.1 billion, 4 years was a number that made some observers go very quiet. Daiwa Bank itself was indicted on 24 counts of fraud and obstruction. It pleaded guilty in February 1996. The fine, $340 million, at the time the largest criminal fine ever imposed on a financial institution in U.S. history. 11 Daiwa executives were named in the proceedings. Several faced charges in both American and Japanese courts. Masahiro Tsuda, the New York general manager who had received Iguchi's confession and participated in the delay, was arrested at JFK Airport in October 1995 as he attempted to fly back to Japan. He was carrying documents. He was wearing a dark overcoat. A federal agent stopped him at the gate. The Japanese government's role in the 2-month silence was investigated but never fully prosecuted. The Ministry of Finance had been notified by Daiwa before American regulators. That fact alone suggested a level of coordination that deeply unsettled American officials and permanently damaged the U.S.-Japan banking relationship. Some documents related to the ministry's involvement were never made public. Some questions were never answered. For the victims, the institutional clients whose bonds had been quietly sold from underneath them, the resolution was deeply incomplete. Daiwa's $340 million fine helped cover some of the losses. Civil settlements followed. But the process was slow, bureaucratic, and exhausting for anyone who had to live through it. In Japan, the scandal accelerated a crisis of confidence in the banking sector that was already building. The 1990s were Japan's lost decade, a period of economic stagnation following the collapse of its asset bubble. Daiwa was not the only Japanese bank concealing losses during this era. It was simply the one that got caught in America, where the regulators had teeth. Daiwa Bank itself survived in Japan. Technically, it merged with Kinki Osaka Bank in 2002 and was eventually absorbed into what became Resona Bank. The name Daiwa Bank ceased to exist. A 77-year institution, gone. Toshihide Iguchi served his prison term and was released. He later wrote a book about his experience, published in Japanese. He described his 11 years of concealment not as a deliberate criminal enterprise, but as a kind of psychological trap. Each cover-up making the next one more necessary, each falsified record making the truth more impossible to speak. He was not wrong about the mechanism, but mechanisms do not make victims whole. The pension fund managers who trusted Daiwa, the institutions that handed custody of their assets to a bank they believed was honorable, the junior employees at Daiwa's 16 American offices who lost their jobs in 90 days through no fault of their own. They were collateral in a disaster they never knew was coming. One auditor who had worked at Daiwa's New York office, a woman named Carol Hartley, who had raised reconciliation questions in 1992 and been reassigned within months, gave a single interview to a journalist in 1997. She said only, "I knew something wasn't right. I was told to focus on other accounts." She never spoke publicly about it again. What stays with you about the Daiwa scandal is not the number. $1.1 billion is large enough to be abstract. It becomes a statistic. What stays with you is the letter. A man sitting alone at the end of 11 years of compounding deception, writing by hand in careful detail the full account of what he had done. Not to an investigator, not to a lawyer, to his boss, because he had finally run out of road. And what his boss did with that letter, the calculation, the 2-month silence, the quiet asset transfers, the bet that it could still be managed, that is the part that should keep you awake, because Toshihide Iguchi's fraud was the act of one desperate man trying to escape a hole he had dug, but the cover-up was institutional, deliberate, coordinated across continents, and the cover-up is always worse than the crime, because the crime says a person broke under pressure. The cover-up says the system knew, and it chose the lie.